Broadcasting live from the Business Radio X studios in Atlanta, Georgia, it's time for High Velocity Radio.
Lee Cantor here, another episode of High Velocity Radio, and this is going to be a good one. Today on the show, we have Jeff Nosanov. He is with Orbital Velocity. Welcome.
Hi, thank you very much for having me.
Well, I'm so excited to learn what you're up to. Tell us a little bit about Orbital Velocity. How you serving folks?
Sure. Well, so Orbital Velocity is my basically my consulting company. I've only been in Atlanta for about a year, but I've lived all over the country. And most of that I was working for NASA in different ways, different organizations. And basically what I do through Orbital Velocity is help aerospace technology companies find work with the federal government or in the state government in some cases. But basically I help people find money.
And so what's your backstory? Have you always been involved in space?
Well, I have been involved with space for about 15 years. I've always been a space nut, kind of personally. And I've worked for several NASA centers as an employee, as a consultant, as a researcher. I've done work with NASA headquarters. I do a lot of work with universities, which are often major partners in various kinds of technology and space exploration work. And here in Atlanta, I'm basically trying to find ways to contribute to those national efforts by helping companies that are trying to provide technologies or missions or really anything the government needs.
Now, I guess on the surface, Atlanta doesn't seem like the logical place to start a consultancy for space.
Sure.
Is there things that we're not aware of that may be happening unbeknownst to the kind of regular folks here in Atlanta?
Sure. So, right on there. I moved here for my wife's career, basically, and I do help companies all over the country, but there is actually a very significant advanced technology world here in Atlanta, largely centered around Georgia Tech and surrounding, companies that spun out of that. I also do work with any agency that does research. So that includes the medical ones. So that could be at Emory or the hospitals and so on. So basically, if a government agency gives out money for research or development, I've probably helped somebody with a proposal there. So basically, if you're looking for federal funds, I can probably help.
Now, do you work with startups at all? Because we have a pretty good startup scene here.
Yes, I love working with startups. I've had one myself. I may again in the future. And it's really a great time to be a startup because there's so much money. There's really stupid amounts of money kind of sloshing around the country and the world and private equity and venture capital. So it's a great time to be starting a company. And most of them are going after the largest customer out there, which is the federal government. So a startup is a great partner and an exciting customer to work with.
So let's look at it through the lens of a startup. Say there's a startup here in Metro Atlanta or Georgia. I don't know if you're aware. At one point a few years ago in South Georgia, they tried to get a spaceport of some kind going in South Georgia that was kind of trying to get some of the stuff that Florida couldn't get to. They were trying to kind of fill that gap, but I don't think they were able to get approval for the land usage. But it seems like we're close enough because obviously Florida is a place for space, but also Huntsville, Alabama is kind of rocket central in their kind of world. So you'd think that Georgia would have opportunities kind of with the entrepreneurial community we have here. But if you're a startup here, at what stage do they kind of start talking to you? Do you want to meet them when they have an idea on a napkin, or do they need to have funding? Like where do you come in, to kind of get the most out of your expertise?
I find it exciting at all stages. I mean, I love helping, working through business plans and investor pitches and all that, and I do that for fun. It's just an interesting and exciting world. But where I can really add a lot of value is when they have a promising technology that they may not know exactly what part of the federal government is interested. Now, they need to know that to get venture capital funding. Certainly, that will be a question they're asked, but also the making sense of the federal government, especially right now in July of 2025, is a real challenge. And that's something I've been doing for 15 years. It's figuring out what the government actually wants to buy and how they want to buy it. So again, you mentioned the Southern Georgia spaceport question. It really would be a great place because it can launch. You can launch stuff south over the ocean. For a lot of space reasons, there's a lot of good reasons to launch to the south, and obviously it's a competitive marketplace with Florida nearby. So I don't think that's the last we'll hear of it.
Yeah, I was pretty bullish about it. Actually, I was kind of disappointed that didn't kind of happen. But you know how this goes. It's nothing happens fast.
Yeah.
Is in your work, is there something you've done that you're kind of the most rewarding success that you've had in your career that you could share?
Yes, absolutely. So I've won over $2 billion, that's with a B, of funding over my career for different companies and customers. But what I'm really excited about is actually something that's launching in a few months. It's a space mission that will study basically the interaction of the sun with the rest of the solar system. I could go on and on about that, but it's basically studying the sun. And in 2018, I was a consultant at Johns Hopkins University in Maryland, and I was a proposal manager for this mission. And it's been quite a journey since then in all kinds of ways. And this mission is still going on, is not affected by the proposed cuts to NASA, which is another subject I could go on about, but I'll try to spare you. But basically, this thing is going to launch into space in a few months, and I plan to be there. Hopefully, they'll invite me. If not, I'll just show up. And it will actually be the first space launch I've ever seen, and it will be really exciting for that to be a rocket launch with a mission on it that I helped make happen. So, and I hope to bring my family there as well. So that's probably the proudest professional accomplishment for me.
What is it like? Like, how do you kind of wrap your mind around working on projects that you're so passionate, everybody's fired up, and it just takes years and years and years and years before something happens? Like, how do you mentally prepare for that kind of a long-term outlook?
I love that question because the answer is really that this kind of work in space and in any kind of advanced technology that usually has a long-term timeline, you really kind of have to deliberately adjust your context, your frame of mind. So, we've been exploring the universe for about 100 years. It was about 100 years ago, actually, that something called the rocket equation was discovered or invented that actually showed that we could launch things from the Earth. That wasn't a given. If the Earth was about 10% bigger, in fact, that wouldn't be possible at all, at least not with the way we do it now. So it's really only been 100 years, and we've really only been doing it consistently for about 70 years. And that's a lifetime, right? And it really is a fact that most meaningful scientific explorations of the solar system, they take 10 years minimum, 10 or 20 or 30 even. And when you kind of fall in love with this subject the way I did and so many other people do, it just puts a different perspective on your life and your career. I know people who, if they're lucky, they will have one completed space mission in their entire working career. And that will be everything. That will be an enormous achievement. It's just the way the universe works. And I've found that one of the most rewarding parts about this work is it forces that kind of humility rather, in the face of very literally the universe and the rules that the universe has that we have to follow. We can't bend them really. So that's really the only way I can answer that question, is it forces a humility before the universe that I think is pretty healthy. I mean, the universe is what it is. We live on a planet full of water and air and food largely, and it's right there for us. But you leave the planet, you got to change your frame of mind because it's not going to make it easy for us. So that's really how I think about it.
Now, what do you say to people that think that going into space, that's wasteful use of resources, that
Sure.
that why aren't we spending anywhere near the amount of energy in the oceans and that are right here that we barely know anything about that? And that's like right under our feet.
So I love the question, and it's a really important one. And it usually comes from some misunderstandings about how this all works. So we're not just sending money into space and, blowing it away. We're spending it on Earth here in our communities and our institutions and our neighbors' salaries. I mean, all of that spending is local. And it's really a really small amount of money, actually. There's a pretty consistent mistaken assumption going all the way back to Apollo, because the Apollo program in the 60s, it really did consume 5% of the federal budget. And there's a whole bunch written about that and how that never would have happened if not for Kennedy's assassination, and they would have shut it down because of that expense, if not for Kennedy's assassination and all of that. But a lot of people still think that's close to the number, but it's less than 1/10 of that. It's 0.2% or something like that, 0.3. It's trivial, really. And on top of that, and keeping in mind all that spending is on American citizens and American companies, every single economic study of NASA has shown that it either returns between 2 or 7 times the amount back to the economy. So it's a net gain for the country and the economy. There's a couple of interesting examples that I like. For example, in the 60s, in the early semiconductor industry, the early computer chips of the modern sort, NASA was one of the biggest customers that literally built the American semiconductor industry because NASA needed a consistent supply of them for Apollo and they needed to be reliable. So there's all kinds of stories from the last 50 years, basically, that NASA not just created markets for technologies that would then later, I should say, not just use them, but literally created markets for industries that the U.S. would then lead in for decades. So that's really my answer to that question is it's not a negative. It doesn't actually cost us anything. It actually returns much more than we spend. And as for the oceans, I agree. We know more about other planets than we do about parts of the ocean. And I imagine if we had that sort of scientific commitment to the oceans, we'd probably have similar economic returns also. So that's my answer. And I hope to be part of sharing that more broadly. So I'm really glad that you asked me.
So for you, it's an and, not an or. Like we should be doing more kinds of research and studying all kinds of things, including space and the oceans. It's not like we should be cutting back in either.
Right. And the Arctic and the poles. I mean, there's I think one of the challenges that science communication faces is you can't really prove that spending money here is going to produce benefits there, but you can look backwards and show that it almost always does. Another example from Apollo is this is actually something that a distant relative of mine worked on. Basically, any kind of kidney dialysis any kind of device that does kidney dialysis, the technology that allowed that to be invented was developed under the Apollo program. It was used for fuel filters and things like that. But that kind of membrane technology was developed for exploring the moon and then became fundamental to keeping millions of Americans alive today. So sometimes you have weird connections like that. Nobody would have expected that to be an output of the Apollo program, but it was. So we should be doing things like trying to cure cancer, but it turns out that if you set even not more ambitious goals, if you set really ambitious goals like sending humans to the moon or Mars, it turns out you have to invent a lot of stuff along the way. And there's really creative people who take those inventions and say, well, we can actually use that for this or that. And those things go on to create enormous markets in industries. And of course, in the case I mentioned, save lives. So again, I could go on about this for hours, but it really does not actually cost us money to do this exploration. It makes us money eventually.
Right, but it's just hard to tell people that they should spend money now on things that there might be unintended consequences later that's going to benefit everybody just by being this curious and this trying to solve problems that are hard.
Right, right, and I think a mixture of short and long term research is probably the better policy, but it's hard to have those kinds of rational policy discussions right now, and I'll leave that there.
Now, in your work over the years, is there any, like, what are the qualities of a young person? Are you seeing more young people attracted to this, or are they getting kind of burnt out?
Actually, it's a wonderful time as a young person to be going into space and scientific fields because there's huge amounts of small companies that are entering the market. I mean, SpaceX really showed that individual companies. Now, it helps if you start with $1 billion or more, but there are a lot of small companies that are making meaningful advances, and not just in the U.S. So it's a great time as a kid to fall in love with space, and political wins here and there aside. The whole world is really embracing these technologies and companies, and so it's. I would encourage anyone to study these things. And again, if you study physics, if you study engineering, this is objective reality, right? Like you can. It's never bad to study objective reality. We need buildings to stand up straight. We need bridges to stay. We need planes to fly. And sometimes I think in our day-to-day community and social and political lives, it's easy to forget that we need our cars to operate without engines exploding. We need to respect nature in that way, and physics and engineering. It gets back to what I was saying earlier about it's never a waste to learn and explore because that's the real world that we live in. So.
Right, but it seems like we're always trying to have that balance of that's great, and that it's almost like a nice to have where we got to have things working here, like
right.
air traffic controllers have
Yes.
to do their job
Yes.
today, and going to Mars seems like a nice idea, but I don't know if I need that today. But
Right.
in order to
And,
go to Mars, we got to do work today that won't show up for 5 years.
There's a great example from 100 years ago that there were people exploring quantum physics, and this was right after the person who ran the patent office, who famously said, I think in 1890 something, he said, everything that's been invented everything that will be invented has been invented already, and this was 1890. And so you have then these scientists studying quantum physics, which was incomprehensibly unrelatable to people, but then 20, 30 years later, the computer was invented, and those principles absolutely underlie every single minute of every single day of every single person on Earth, because otherwise our electronics wouldn't work and our computers wouldn't work. So a nation, an organization ought to have a kind of short, medium, and long-term approach to these things. So we need to solve the immediate problems, but if we don't explore the unknowns, first of all, someone else is going to, and then they will lead those industries. But it takes a balance.
Now, how do you know which kind of, I'll call it a quote unquote moonshot should you be focusing in on? How do you prioritize? Like, a lot of people want to go to Mars now. People are exploring the edges of the galaxies. How do you, and you mentioned this, doing research towards the sun. How do you kind of prioritize and go, what, this is where we have to put our chips?
Sure. Well, that's another great question. And it reminds me of a really interesting scenario that happened in the late 60s, which was, when no human being or no machine has ever left the Earth, it's pretty obvious where to go, which is to go up, and the first place to send humans is pretty obviously the moon, because it's the closest thing, it's the easiest thing to get to. It's obviously still exceptionally difficult, but it's still the easiest thing. And NASA had a real question after that, which was, well, now what? Now that we've shown we can leave the Earth and send machines and even people places, what do we do next? And the history of NASA since then, which I could, again, go on all day, but I'll try not to, it kind of really reflects that question. I mean, NASA started sending robotic vehicles to other planets, first to Mars and Venus, which were the closest ones in either direction, and eventually leading to having sent robotic vehicles either to or past all of the planets in the solar system. And we haven't sent humans anywhere since, other than the space station. So that's a really important question. What do we do next? And the way NASA handles it, kind of connecting back to my work, is with competitive proposal opportunities, where the federal government, through the national academies, will basically say, here are some scientific questions of interest, and there'll actually be a sort of competitive process where organizations build teams and they say, well, okay, we have these technologies, we can go explore the rocks on Mars, and we can ask the questions about life on Mars, or we can go study the clouds of Venus, and so on. And so there's no great easy answer to your question other than an ongoing discussion between experts and policymakers and people like that. And what we've seen throughout the history of NASA since then is pretty much all of those challenges will yield and demand technology developments that become useful elsewhere. So again, another great question. There's no easy answer to it, but the history of what we've done so far kind of, I think, shows a pretty reasonable approach.
Now, what about the input, like you mentioned earlier, of now you have billionaires that have pet projects, and they have resources to do some interesting things. Are they kind of skewing those priorities to what their kind of interests are?
Well, it's a very interesting question, and I'll start by talking about SpaceX. SpaceX, what they did basically was, there was a business observation that the bar for contractor performance for the federal government was actually really low. And I mean, by contractor, I mean the aerospace contractors of the late 20th century that were building rockets. They were really good at making a lot of money on space launch. And what SpaceX realized was that, hey, if we build this all in-house and we charge for it roughly at cost plus a modest fee, they could reduce the cost by a factor by 90%. And that still is the case. And that's why SpaceX just celebrated 500 launches of its Falcon 9 vehicle. Now, so that's a really positive example of industry and market forces really reducing the cost of a critical need. Now, other subjects, I mean, the philanthropy of billionaires or the investment of billionaires can really jumpstart a lot of technology projects in ways that the federal government would take a lot longer to fund. So I think it's a great part. It's a wonderful outcome of basically the enormous economic success of the United States of the last 50 years, is that there even are people with that amount of money that rival governments in some cases. Now, what we're seeing now is something a little more concerning to me, which is some of the wealthiest people in the U.S. actually try to kind of capture some of what used to be federal government priorities like medical research and things like that, in order to then have more control of those services in the marketplace. At least that's my perception. That's the only way I can make sense, again, without getting super political, that's the only way I can make sense of reducing things like NIH budgets and research, is by saying, well, if you have the resources to do that privately, well, then you also control that. You control the availability and pricing of the ultimate services. So I think it's a net positive because that kind of largesse can be applied to research questions faster. But as anything at that scale, there's going to be some ethical considerations that I think are worth paying attention to.
And if it was through the government, it sounds like the outcomes or those unintended consequences were for the betterment of all. Whereas if a private company is doing it, then they kind of lock down that new.
I mean, yeah, that's sort of that's sort of the conclusion I'm coming to. I mean, any specifics are a lot more complicated. I'm certainly not going to argue that the government is the most efficient organization out there. And certainly companies are able to capture publicly funded research for their own private gain. I mean, that happens in pharma all the time. But in principle, at least, having public research organizations and private, I think, is a good mix for a society. With the acknowledgement that it would take the rest of the day to really break down all of the pieces.
Right, but conceptually, though, public-private's probably the best thing, knowing that there's no perfect one, and it's going to be messy no matter which way you go.
And you don't really want the government operating a factory, a medicine factory, but you also don't want a single company controlling all,
right, to have a monopoly on that.
Right, exactly. So these aren't really new, economic debates. They probably go back to, the Enlightenment, but it's rare that, as we're seeing in 25, there are such drastic changes in these things being put out there, particularly today, literally today, as the federal budget is in debate. So these are all things that someone competing for federal money would want to keep in mind, and some of the context that I bring to my customers.
So what do you need more of? How can we help you? What are some of the things that you want to accomplish in the short term and the long term, and what resources do you need to make those happen?
Well, I really appreciate that question. I mean, what I always want to do is meet people who are interested in solving these big problems. And whether or not they become my customers is less important, because I just like meeting people like that in general. But I can also help people like that find a pathway to creating something that can do something big or really help people. So that's really what I hope, if anyone's listening who works at a company like that or has an idea or is doing some kind of research. Those are the kinds of people that I want to meet.
Good stuff. Well, if somebody wants to learn more and connect with you, what's the website? What's the best way to connect?
Yeah, it's orbitalvelocity.space. And I love that both our companies have the velocity in it. And I imagine my email or phone number might be in the show notes for this, but you can just go to my website, orbitalvelocity.space, and send me a note there.
Good stuff. Well, Jeff, thank you so much for sharing your story today. You're doing such important work, and we appreciate you.
Thank you. And likewise, and it's a pleasure to speak with you and the local community.
All right, this is Lee Cantor. We'll see you all next time on High Velocity Radio.